Today is the inaugural event for the new Center for Security in Politics, which is a center founded and run by the Goldman School's Janet Napolitano, who knows quite a bit about politics and security. CSP is the first of its kind across the country, an academic center focused solely on the nexus of security in politics. It is not a timely topical nexus in light of what we have just seen politically across the country and what we've experienced over the last few years. We are proud to have this center here at Berkeley and in Goldman. Today is the center's inaugural event, and let me introduce our distinguished moderator for today's discussion, the Honorable Douglas B. Wilson. Doug's 40-year career in public service is nothing short of amazing. Most recently, he served as Assistant Secretary of Defense, where he led the largest communications public affairs group in the world. He was awarded the Distinguished Public Service Medal 3 times. And he also helped to lead the effort to repeal and replace the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy at the Department of Defense. He's worked in both the public and private sectors, advising corporations from Boeing to Microsoft and presidential candidates from Gary Hart, Bill Clinton to Pete Buttigieg. Doug, that's an amazing career, and thank you for being with us for this kickoff event today. Please take it from here.
Dean Brady, thank you very much. And congratulations to you and to Secretary Napolitano and the University of California at Berkeley and your Goldman School of Public Policy for this initial event, founding of the Center for Security in Politics. Given all that's going on in today's world, the word I think of with what you've done is prescient. This is an absolutely amazing time to be focusing on the work that you're going to be doing, and I'm very excited to be part of this inaugural event. To those who are participating in this event and listening in, this is a very, very special discussion in my view. We are joined today by 4 of America's leading experts and thought leaders on security and politics. The Department of Homeland Security has been in existence for 20 years. And the discussants today are the 4 men and women who have led the department from its inception to the beginning of the Trump administration. We all remember where we were on September 11th, 2001. And in the wake of that terrible event, then President Bush established the Department of Homeland Security and appointed a 2-term governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Ridge, to be its first secretary. Governor Ridge is an accomplished lawyer. He has served in the U.S. Army. He today advises both public and private sector individuals on a variety of security and risk management issues. Governor Ridge, welcome. The second Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff, is currently chairman of the Chertoff Group. He was the secretary from 2005 to 2009, appointed by President George W. Bush. He's a graduate of Harvard and Harvard Law School. He clerked for Supreme Court Justice William Brennan and is one of this country's noted legal and security experts. Secretary Chertoff, welcome. Now a professor of public policy at the Goldman School, my friend for 40 years, Janet Napolitano, is now also the director of this new Center for Security and Politics at UC Berkeley. She was also the 20th president of the University of California and served as Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama. She is a former 2-term governor of Arizona, a former Attorney General of Arizona, and a former U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona. Secretary Napolitano, thank you for having us and welcome. Jeh Johnson followed Secretary Napolitano as Secretary of Homeland Security during President Obama's 2nd term. I had the pleasure of meeting and serving with him when he was General Counsel for the Department of Defense under President Obama. He also served as General Counsel for the Air Force during the Clinton administration. And if you'll permit me a personal note, I'm just absolutely delighted to also note that Jeh Johnson was co-chair of the effort to repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell legislation. He now practices law and serves as a regular commentator for a variety of television news outlets. He's a graduate of Morehouse and of Columbia Law. He's debated at both Oxford and Cambridge Union, so fellow panelists, be aware. And Secretary Johnson, welcome. We all on this panel remember a time when elections were sacrosanct, when you went to the polls, when you voted, when there was a winner, when whoever lost acknowledged that. Transitions were smooth. The threats to our national security came from abroad, and beginning in 2016, even then, the threat of Russian interference was a prime topic. In our last election, that changed, and domestic violence and threats from within rose to the fore. We saw things on January 6th that none of us have ever seen before with the insurrection at the US Capitol. We await next week a second impeachment of the 45th president. The trial begins next week. So as we begin this discussion to the members of the panel, I think we want to focus on how did we get here? What is it going to take to get us out of here? And what are we going to do to address the problems while we are here? When the Department of Homeland Security was established with Governor Ridge, when you were the first secretary of that department, the focus was international terrorism, particularly from radicals and terrorists in the Middle East. But Secretary Napolitano, in the final years of your tenure, you noted that lone wolves within the United States were the greatest threat to our security. So Secretary Ridge, let me just start with you by asking this question. Do we now have the greatest threat to American security from lone wolf aggregated? Is this now the greatest threat?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you and the school and my colleagues to be on the panel with such distinguished colleagues, and I might add friends. It's a great pleasure for me. And just a quick anecdote as it refers to your opening comments. On 9/11/2001, I was in Shanksville overseeing a smoldering hole where Flight 93 went inverted at over 500 miles an hour into the ground in Pennsylvania. But Americans from all walks of life chose to frustrate the effort of terrorists to breach the Capitol. Fast forward almost 20 years, and January 6th, unfortunately, the Capitol was breached not by foreign terrorists, but by Americans. And it puts in part in perspective the change in the domestic political environment, and perhaps reflected a modest way the change in the global environment vis-a-vis security and politics. I think it is pretty clear that the threat has metastasized since those early analysis of the threat emerged in the end of 2001 and 2002. We pretty much narrowly defined the group of terrorists. Well, now it's global, and but in addition to that global scourge, and it is indeed a global scourge, we've seen the ascension of a much more nationalistic Russia, a much more expansionist China that's military, diplomatic, and economic reach has moved aggressively in this past 15 or 20 years. And then on top of all of that, you note the extremism in the United States and the lone wolf. And unfortunately, even the notion of lone wolf domestic terrorism is somewhat of a misnomer, because as we've seen from some of the arrests and some of the monitoring of some of these extremist groups, they don't act in isolation, they act in concert. So you take the totality of those threats that have emerged and expanded since 2001, President Biden inherits probably the most complex set of both domestic and international threats to our security and our political system that any modern day president has ever seen.
Secretary Ridge, let me build on that and ask Secretary Napolitano, as the person who first identified the lone wolf threat. Your friend L.A. Mayorkas is now taken the reins at the Department of Homeland Security. In your view, is the Department of Homeland Security prepared for the kind of threat that you first identified and that we have seen in its latest manifestation on January 6th?
Thanks, Doug. And I too want to thank my fellow panelists and friends who have also served as secretary of what is the third largest department of the federal government. Like President Biden, now Secretary Mayorkas inherits an extraordinarily complex threat environment. I don't know that I was the first to identify lone wolves as an interior threat to the security of the United States. But I agree with Secretary Ridge that that threat has changed now into a whole cluster of groups who are willing to commit acts of violence in furtherance of whatever their political views happen to be. And that changing threat environment, I think, is a hallmark of the Department of Homeland Security. The threat environment constantly changes, and the department needs to be able to change with it. One of the issues that Secretary Mayorkas is going to have to deal with, however, is that the department is coming out of 4 years where there's been a constant turnover in leadership, where many of the leadership positions in the department have been left vacant for some substantial periods of time, and where there's been no strategic direction for the department, at least one that is apparent to me. And so he's going to have to change and move the department to deal with the current threat environment. He's going to have to help develop a new strategic direction for what the Department of Homeland Security needs to focus on. And at the same time, he's going to have to keep looking ahead to what the next threats are likely to be and where they are likely to come from. So it is not an easy set of tasks that he has before him.
Secretary Chertoff, just building on what Secretary Napolitano has just said, given the nature of the kinds of threats that we're seeing exemplified by the January 6th, when you were Secretary of Homeland Security, did you feel you had the tools to deal with these kinds of threats? And what are the kinds of tools, what are the kinds of capabilities that you would like to see the legislative branch, if any, give to the department now to be able to deal with these more effectively?
I think let me first of all congratulate you on this new enterprise, this new center, and my friend John Napolitano for launching this. I don't want to repeat what Tom and Janet have said. Let me say this: I don't know that it's so much an issue of authorities as it is an issue of strategic redirection. Obviously, we need to continue to deal with global jihadism. I know for at least for some period of time, CISA at DHS has been looking at the issue of foreign disinformation efforts, and that's got to continue. But I think what is different is the challenge of dealing with domestic terrorism, given the legal constraints that apply when you are investigating US citizens, particularly for things that move back and forth between political speech and actual incitement or terrorist plotting. So, there's been some talk about having a domestic terrorism statute. I would be careful about that because you have to be sure you don't wind up incidentally or even intentionally encroaching on areas that are First Amendment protected. On the other hand, I don't think the First Amendment is a talisman that allows you to conspire and incite violence and insurrection. And so we have to be careful to define it with precision and not to let it become a sloppy way of justifying any kind of domestic terrorist activity as long as it has a verbal component. So I would say that those are critical, but the one other thing I think is very important for the department going forward is to rebuild trust on the part of the American people. Much of what was done politically, directed and driven by the White House and imposed on the department because, particularly towards the end, you didn't have permanent leadership. And so there was kind of a weak governance structure. Much of what was imposed by the White House really created a rupture in people's confidence in the non-political nature of the department. You had, for example, the use of things like family separation, not merely as a way of getting people to attend their hearings and be adjudicated, but as a deterrent by being cruel and punitive with respect to children. I think that created a lot of distrust. I think some of the use last year of border security officials in places like Portland to be very aggressive and in some ways, in my mind, overstepping their mission, again, created a sense of a department that had become a political tool. So much of what will have to happen initially on the part of Secretary Mayorkas and the White House is to reestablish the sense of a department as a nonpartisan, apolitical agency like the Department of Defense.
Secretary Johnson, I'm going to ask you as well for comments that you might have in terms of what you think the department needs to address the current problems. But I want to use this as a bridge to ask you to comment on points that you have been very publicly articulate about in the media, and that is the whole issue of white nationalism and racism as a core element of what we're seeing exemplified by January 6th. There are many Black and white political and community leaders who say that the basic cause of what we are seeing is racism and white backlash against movements like Black Lives Matter. What are your views on this? Is this what defines the right-wing violence that we saw manifested on January 6th? Is this what's driving the potential for long-term violence here?
Doug, thanks for the question. It's good to see you again, my former colleague from the Department of Defense, when you were Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs and I was General Counsel. I heard the Dean make a very interesting observation about you, that you led the largest communications department any place. What the Dean may not appreciate is when it comes to the Department of Defense, everything is the largest something. You ran the largest communications shop. I ran the largest law firm. There are 11,000 lawyers in the Department of Defense. It's got the largest fleet of planes, the most ships, the most people. So everything about the Department of Defense is big.
I didn't get to build though, so.
Right. I'd also note that the four of us former secretaries were very much a club. Sometimes we even get confused for one another. I've walked into bars and restaurants where HSI agents look at me and say, "Hello, Secretary Chertoff, nice to see you again." For some reason, I've never confused with Governor Ridge, however. He's much better looking and taller. But Doug, thank you for the question. It's a very important question. We talk about how we are a nation bitterly divided. I think it goes beyond that. I think that misses the mark in many ways. The reality about our country, and I hate to say this, but the reality of our country is that there is a strand in our society that is racist, intolerant, prone to violence, and we saw that on January 6th. We saw it in Charlottesville in 2017, but we saw that also in 1957. The grainy black and white photographs of people resisting the integration of the school system in Little Rock, Arkansas. We saw it on the university campuses of Mississippi and Alabama in the 1960s as they shouted down Black students who wanted nothing more than to get an education. What is new now, and the reason why the alarm bells have to go even higher is this segment of our population has been told it's okay to crawl out from your rock. And they have been emboldened by national leadership to say you're special people, there's good on both sides, and therefore it's okay to go to Charlottesville and demonstrate your hate in the open, or go to the US Capitol and engage in what amounted to an insurrection. And that's not going away anytime soon. The reason it's not going away is it's gaining in energy. This group will now be in the opposition. They will no longer feel like they have a voice in the White House. They are going to be in the opposition. Their grievances and anger will only get worse. And the larger problem we have, and several of us here, I know Mike has talked about this, Tom and Janet have talked about this. There's a even larger segment of our population that is allowed to exist in a fake news world. They are able to look at things that frame themselves as news and information and believe it. They're allowed to believe that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States. They're allowed to believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. And so you add all of this up and it creates, in my judgment, a whole new and very dangerous environment. And if you'll allow me, I want to answer the questions you put to the prior secretaries. Is DHS equipped to deal with this? The short answer is no. DHS, as Tom knows, was created in 2002 on the assumption that terrorism was an extraterritorial threat from beyond our borders, launched by groups like Al-Qaeda. And if you therefore put in one cabinet level department all the different ways one can enter this country, land, sea, and air, you've effectively dealt with terrorism. But the principal terrorist threat now in our country is domestic based. It is right here. And there's not a whole lot of DHS police running around the interior looking for domestic terrorism. Many would say there shouldn't be. And so DHS exists largely on the borders, at the ports, on the land borders, at the airports, Secret Service, FEMA. So DHS itself, Homeland Security itself, is not equipped to deal with this latest threat. And that's why I think the existing administration, the Congress, needs to take a hard look at how we might realign our government to better effectively address this threat.
Hey, Doug, if I might comment, piggyback
Yes.
the words of my colleagues. First of all, I think all of us agreed that for the past 4 years, particularly the last 1 or 2, our department, and we have enormous respect and admiration for the men and women that work there and go to work every day trying to make America safer and more secure, but it's been a political piñata. I mean, the president's, a lot of his political advocacy that attracted him to a certain core group around the country was based in within the department. And so therefore, and they received attacks from both the right and the left. And one of the biggest challenges, I think Janet pointed it out, is for the new secretary, for Secretary Mayorkas to kind of rebuild confidence, rebuild the morale, because it hasn't been subdued and really adversely affected by having been put, not by design, but by presidential design, not by department design, in the middle of a political maelstrom. The other comment I'd like to make, and perhaps this is your job, Doug, and I'm not trying to preempt it. One of the areas that I think the new administration needs to explore aggressively is an appreciation that the FBI can't deal with domestic terrorism on their own. DHS wasn't designed to be the primary agency to confront, defend against, identify and defend against domestic terrorists. And so you have this paucity of manpower in a major department. FBI only has 35,000 people. At some point in time, to deal with the domestic threat, it is my opinion, and I think Secretary Chertoff, Michael pointed out the area of trust. we better begin to understand and appreciate how critically important it is to trust the state and local law enforcement community with the information that is gathered by the information gathering capabilities we have at the federal government. You can't secure the country from inside the Beltway from either international terrorism or domestic terrorism. And I don't know about how things changed with my successors, but developing that trust between the federal government and sharing information across the board and letting it down into the state and locals, get 700,000 men and women down there that could be engaged, not individually, but depending department on department, and depending on the group you're looking at, could be far more engaged in helping to defend against these domestic terrorists.
Secretary Ridge, I'm going to take that excellent point that you have made and direct this question to Secretary Napolitano and Secretary Chertoff, and broaden it just a second, if that's all right. If you are to expand the universe of people for whom a responsibility of dealing with these new domestic threats, to which responsibility becomes broad. You have today Secretary Lloyd Austin at the Defense Department, who is asking each of the services to stand down to examine whether or not there are elements of domestic terrorism within the ranks. There are people who have said that there are such elements even in our own police departments and other state and local entities. So in asking you, Secretary Napolitano and Secretary Chertoff, to comment on what Secretary Ridge had to say, could you also comment on the fact that while it's by no means a majority at all in terms of the military or our police departments, they are not immune? Secretary Napolitano?
Okay, yes, and I was pleased to see that Secretary Austin is going to have a stand down within DOD and a good, hard interior look. I think such actions can be taken throughout law enforcement across the country. I want to build on what Secretary Ridge said. Now, when I came to the federal government, I came out of a state background. I'd been a state AG, I'd been a governor, and that's really where the resources are for dealing with crime. In general, crime is handled by local police departments or your state Department of Public Safety. It's not inherently federal. The federal government, as large as it is really not established domestically in the way to have the sort of presence that local law enforcement does. Where I think DHS plays a role here and is value add is in not only being a consumer of intelligence about groups that are organizing and perhaps planning further insurrectionist type activity, but then to share that intel on a real-time basis into the local law enforcement environment so that they know what to watch for and they have actionable information about who to watch out for. And so DHS does have a role to play domestically, but in my view, it's really on the information sharing side of the ledger.
Secretary Chertoff.
Yeah, so Doug, I agree with what my, Tom and Janet have said. Let me just add a few points. First of all, I do think in terms of introspection, that Secretary Austin is correct. I think we have to look in DHS as well. I'm a little concerned about stories that right before the end of the Trump administration, an agreement was signed with the unions for the border agencies that at least gives them the impression they have a veto over policy. And typically the unions have been the most aggressive in promoting kind of a harsh approach to migration. And from a governance standpoint, that's troubling, but it also suggests you need to take a close look to make sure there aren't people pursuing their own agenda. More generally, I would agree that engaging with local and state officials, and not just police, but community leaders and even people in the social services agencies may allow you to identify people who are on the way to getting radicalized, but haven't yet become hardcore members of extremist groups. And being able to give them an off-ramp and deal with them at the local level in some ways may be the lowest key and most effective way, rather than waiting until they wind up mobilizing at the Capitol for another January 6th. The last thing I would say is almost at the other end of the spectrum. You know, we've heard someone describe this as lone wolves or domestic. It's actually networked right-wing terrorism, and it is international. I observed to you, for example, that in Germany, they had to disband a commando unit of the military because it was full of Nazi sympathizers. We've seen, for example, Breivik in Norway being cited by the shooter in New Zealand. So using social media, these extremists from around the world are inciting each other and supporting each other. And so to the extent DHS has learned to collaborate with foreign intelligence and police agencies in terms of sharing information and strategy, that's going to be useful in dealing with right-wing terrorism as well.
Secretary Chertoff, let's take the point you've just raised about social media. And let's actually talk about that in terms of DHS itself. Twitter and Facebook have banned former President Trump from using their platforms. And after what a lot of people are saying is too long and possibly too late, all of those social media platforms, the major ones, are moving more aggressively to prohibit messages promoting hate and violence. I want to start with you, Secretary Johnson, your views on the role and responsibilities of social media in addressing the conflict between free speech and security, and your views about DHS and its relationship, or what should be its relationship in dealing with social media to address these issues.
So, tough question. Social media platforms, internet service providers should not regard themselves simply as conduits of information like a telephone or an iPhone. They are more than that. They have the ability to prioritize, to push certain messages at us depending upon our search patterns and the like. They're beginning to step up to this responsibility in my observation. Some would argue it's a little too late. I believe that the government should be reluctant, should resist getting into the business of trying to regulate what appears on social media. We don't do that in this country. We don't try to regulate or edit or ban certain types of content. Think about what certain actors could do if they had the authority in government to deem something fake news. In terms of what role DHS has, this is something we thought about in the Obama administration. Could DHS, for example, serve as a trusted source of information from groups that should be flagged, should be banned possibly in an advisory role, because DHS, along with the intelligence community and the law enforcement community, is sometimes in a better position to know than those in the private sector. But this is a difficult question. I know Mike has thought a lot about this too, about what the government's role should be and what more social media can do about this. A large part of our problem, as I said earlier, is due to the fact that Americans can believe what they want to believe, hate who they want to hate, based upon things they see on social media that reaffirm their own suspicions and prejudices.
Secretary Ridge, do you agree with Secretary Johnson that there really shouldn't be, a major role in telling social media platforms what they can or cannot say?
Well, I think before you talk about whether they have a role to play, I think the answer is yes, they have a role to play. Then again, what is it? I think we probably all agree that the internet is an opportunity for all of us to express our ideas, and we understand that right of expression is guaranteed by our Constitution. But the question becomes, are there guardrails around what can be said and what is appropriate to be said, and who should set those guardrails? We certainly would not be inclined to empower, say, the FCC to monitor content and determine what should flow out to the general public. At the same time, we also take a look at and again, I'm going to defer to the lawyers who've paid a lot more attention to the FCC and the certain Communication Decency Act, I think it is called, in Section 230, that protects the internet service providers and protects the social media companies from any potential liability based on what flows through their tube. So one, I think it is worthy of a much more aggressive public conversation than we've ever had before. What I've noted over the past year or two, it's interesting and probably only in America could happen, a variety of nonprofits led by individuals who are very, very cautious about government imposing any kind of restraint on freedom of speech, but actually taking it upon themselves to dive as best they can into the dark web and to identify hashtags, identify organizations associated with promoting the kind of violence that we saw around January 6th, and then making that information available to the FBI and perhaps other federal law enforcement agencies. So I think the time has come in the 21st century, with the ubiquity of the internet and with the fact that it is a means and an outlet for expression, for speech, that we have that kind of public conversation as to in what manner or form can we oversee it to see that the incendiary speech and the incendiary advocacy, if there's a limit beyond which we can call it, they've exceeded they're now yelling fire in a crowded theater, as it were, and can be held liable accordingly. I do not pretend to have the legal sophistication to take you down the path to resolve it in that fashion, but it's time to think of guardrails. And the only thing I'm very happy to report and comfortable with, because I know some of the individuals and companies that are taking a deep dive into the social media platforms and identifying the anti-Semitic and identifying the racist and identifying some of the more incendiary groups and how they're promoting this kind of overt activity, much of which we saw manifest itself on January 6th.
Secretary Chertoff, let me just ask you here, do you have anything to add here in terms of recommendations about how a government agency like DHS ought to be dealing with social media?
Well, I don't think DHS is a regulator of speech, although they can certainly advise and use information as a way of giving a heads up to the platforms if there is something brewing on their platforms that is potentially going to result in violence or hate crimes or things of that sort. But I'd be very careful about empowering a government agency to go after platforms, anything other than what is clearly hardcore incitement or a calls to violence or child pornography or things like that. I do think there's a broader area where the platforms should exercise responsibility to curate what they have on their sites and be willing to remove people who are using the sites for nefarious purposes. I mean, that to me is an editorial function, much the same way the newspaper doesn't have to run everybody's letters in the newspaper. And I think more you're seeing the platforms recognize, partly because they're getting pressure from advertisers, that they do need to be a little bit more aggressive. The last thing I would say is this. One of the real challenges with the platforms, and this is an area where government could compel transparency, is the use of algorithms as a way of driving people down the so-called rabbit hole of extremism. These algorithms are designed mainly for commercial purposes. They're trying to basically get eyeballs and clicks because that increases the value of a site and therefore the advertisers pay more. But a byproduct of the algorithms is that if you go online to look up, white identity or something of that sort, it will then begin to recommend sites that are more and more extreme. And for some people, that lures them into a very, very dangerous place. So transparency about how algorithms work, how they ought to be restrained, and even barring algorithms for certain kinds of speech, I think would not be a First Amendment problem and might have some real value. And we've got to take a look at that.
Secretary Napolitano, I'm going to ask two questions of you. One, to conclude this discussion, social media comments that you have on your how you deal with social media as an expander of some of the issues we're having to confront right now. But I'd also like you to begin the discussion then on foreign interference. In 2016, Russian cyber interference with our election was a major issue. And rather than diminish, the cyber threats from foreign nations have only increased. And it's kind of amazing that that issue was not the foremost issue in 2020. There were different issues, but nevertheless, that remains a major problem. What's your view about how this administration ought to address those?
Well, let me follow up on first what Michael Chertoff said. The whole issue of algorithms, I actually think deserves a lot of work and is an area where both the social media companies and perhaps the government can come together, because the algorithms work exactly as Mike said. They're designed to keep people on the site and to keep clicking through and clicking through and clicking through. And they take people down these rabbit holes into ever more extreme content on the web. And it seems to me that companies should not be immune from liability for how those algorithms are deployed. If those algorithms lead people ultimately to commit, to go on sites, et cetera, where they become radicalized to the extent of committing acts of violence. So that's an area that really deserves examination and reform. With respect to foreign interference in elections, we know that the Russians were interfering in our 2016 election. There was no indication that they have stopped that interference, but it does seem that the United States and DHS through CISA, working with election departments throughout the country, we're much better prepared for that, so that, foreign interference in 2020, it does not appear to have been the issue that causes the concern that it did in 2016. But I'd be eager to hear my fellow panelists on that one.
Well, you will have a chance now, because I'm going to start with Secretary Johnson and ask his views.
So my general attitude, which I conveyed to people at DHS when I was in office, was don't plan for the last attack, plan for the next one. Anticipate the next move of the adversary. And I was inclined to believe that as we approach the 2020 election. The Russians have probably moved on from any attempts at infiltrating our election infrastructure, and they're going to try something else. Yet our intelligence community, the current intelligence community, told us that the lights are all blinking red, that we have to worry about this. The Russians are active in this space, and we need to focus on this. Turned out that wasn't the threat. Instead, it was SolarWinds, which was a much bigger infiltration, a much bigger hack that infiltrated both the private sector and the government sector. And the real threat in terms of the election was domestic based. It was the insurrection on the U.S. Capitol. So we have to always try to anticipate what is coming next. And I agree with Janet that over the last 4 years, a lot of good work has been done, both by DHS and state election officials, to improve upon the cybersecurity of our democracy and our election infrastructure.
Secretary Ridge, your thoughts?
I think Assistant Secretary Chris Krebs helped debunk the big lie with regard to the election results. There was no tampering at all by the Russians directly into the campaign. But I think it's pretty clear to those of us who stay in touch with our friends in the government, and it's a lot of it just public information and knowledge. So many articles written about the sustained engagement by Russia and other nation states to use the internet and to use social media platforms as a means of spreading disinformation throughout the country with a mindset toward affecting conduct and attitudes toward the system, democratic system itself, reinforcing the big lie that the election was stolen. That's an attitudinal, sustaining that mindset, but also promoting the kind of violence that occurred on January 6th. So we can probably be comfortable that the adequate precautions were taken to inhibit any nation state from interfering electronically in the electoral process. But the more nefarious and the more sustained and the more ongoing challenge we have with the use of the internet, the malignant use of the internet and social media platforms, is the kind of effort to affect attitudes and to promote action. And we've seen that evidenced on January 6th. I mean, there are actually some reports that, there are groups that follow hashtags, and there are hashtags that suggest out there may be another public confrontation down the road. So again, the FBI and the intelligence community and those who have far greater cyber capabilities than I do, and more insight than I may have into one or two of these organizations that follow this social media traffic and follow specific hashtags. But it's nefarious, it's deep, it's sustained. It's something that democracies writ large are going to have to get used to. Let's face it, the Russians probably intervened in the Brexit debate. They intervened, I think, in French and Italian elections. They tried to intervene in ours. Direct impact on the electoral system in terms of electronically, probably not. But there are so many other ways you can affect outcomes, and conduct and attitudes are two of the most critical. We've seen it before, and this is one area where I would say to my friend Jeh Johnson, we know they've done it before. This, we know they're going to do it again. They'll probably just use different vehicles to do it.
Secretary Chertoff, I'm going to ask you to do two things. One, to conclude this part of the discussion and your views on Russian and other foreign interference, and also to start the final part of our discussion on immigration. all four of you have had to deal with the issue of immigration during your tenure. And so, Secretary Chertoff, after you've addressed the Russian issue, in talking about immigration, what would be your major recommendation to incoming Secretary Mayorkas in terms of what he needs to be aware of in dealing with the issue of immigration, based on your own personal experience and lessons learned during your own tenure?
So just on the Russians, I fully assume the Russians are going to continue to try to influence attitudes in the US, create dissension, even incite violence. I mean, if you look at some of the indictments that Bob Mueller and his office filed, you see that the Russians don't only operate on one, they even send people over to kind of foment hostility between right wing and left wing groups. This is right out of the old Soviet playbook. This hasn't changed. If you want to get an example of the full panoply of Russian tactics, look at Ukraine, where you not only have disinformation, you have cyber attacks, and you also have use of so-called, quote, militias that actually spur violence and rebellion. So I fully expect we'll see more of that. One of the big issues for the incoming administration is going to be to send a very clear message, which I think President Biden did in his first call with Putin, that we will not suffer in silence, and we will respond forcefully to efforts to subvert our unity or our system. But I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge. On the issue of immigration, this can be very hard. And I know that Secretary Mayorkas dealt with this when he was Deputy Secretary under my successors. Obviously, the irrationality and hostility and cruelty of the prior administration must be disavowed. But at the same time, I think he's going to have to be careful not to somehow suggest, everybody come on in, doors wide open, because that will cause a very, very stiff negative reaction. So I think what has to happen, you need to have the resources and the strategy to encourage legitimate asylum seekers to make their applications and have them rapidly adjudicated. I actually believe there is room for increasing the amount of legal migration and temporary worker programs. But at the same time, you have to be willing to enforce the laws against people who don't want to take the legal route, but who want to sneak in somehow and then just dodge law enforcement. So I think Secretary Mayorkas is going to have to balance tough enforcement where you're dealing with people who are not playing by the rules, but applying the rules in a fair and generous way and adjudicating matters promptly and fairly. And there's going to be pressure on both sides. Some people are going to be waiting to pounce, saying it's open borders. And on the other side of the spectrum, some people are going to say, now finally we can just open the door to everybody. So that's, in my personal view, that's going to be a very, very big issue for the new secretary to deal with.
Secretary Napolitano, same question to you.
Well, I think immigration is amongst the most difficult public policy issues we have in our country. And part of it stems from the inability of Congress to deal with it comprehensively and to update our laws to better reflect our values, to better reflect economic reality in the United States. And so the department is charged with enforcing a law that is, sorely out of date. I mean, I think there are some tasks that Secretary Mayorkas can take on immediately. They need to move resources to the border so they can begin to adjudicate the asylum claims of the 60,000 or so asylum applicants that have been sent to Mexico to wait for the adjudication of their claims. Some of those applicants have been waiting for 2 years or more. Those claims need to be dealt with. He needs to rejuvenate the resettlement of refugee program. President Biden has said that he wants to lift the cap on refugees. Under President Trump, he'd reduced it to 15,000. Effectively, it was almost zero this last year, in part due to COVID. President Biden wants to raise it to 125,000 or so. But the resettlement program that goes along with that has been gutted. So Secretary Mayorkas needs to reinstitute that. He's already in charge of a task force to try to reunify parents and children who were separated under the Trump administration. And where they haven't yet been able to reunify those families. And so that's a very difficult task because the parents were deported back to their countries of origin from whatever village or town they came from. There were no records were kept. And the children likewise were moved around the United States. No records apparently were kept. So trying to reunify those families is a difficult administrative task. In terms of interior enforcement, that's done by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And there, I think Ali needs to reinstitute the priorities for enforcement that we set under the Obama administration, that you focus on those in the country illegally who've committed other crimes, who are known security threats or known members of violent gangs, and concentrate your immigration enforcement authorities there. That you stop some of the processes that were deployed under the prior administration, waiting outside of schools, waiting outside of courthouses to see if you can find somebody who's undocumented and is in the country. You have to be more targeted and more strategic. There are too many people in the country who are undocumented to be able to deport all of them. And so you have to identify those that also present the greatest public safety risk to the country. And getting ICE back on a priorities-based enforcement process and discipline, that will be a leadership challenge for Ali.
Secretary Ridge and Secretary Johnson, you will get the final words on this question before we turn to general questions from our audience. So Secretary Ridge, from your own experience, any advice for the new secretary?
Well, I want to be associated, thank you, Doug. I do want to be associated with the remarks of my colleagues, and I had just 2 or 3 additional points. I was a young congressman in the middle of the 80s, the last time we had any significant effort to come up with a broad and more comprehensive immigration plan. Now, fast forward 35 years, we're still operating under without an immigration plan. And it's time that both parties, both sides of the aisle, in my mind, quit playing political football with the issue of immigration and began developing a plan consistent with our needs internally, as well as our moral conviction that those who seek to come to the United States, there should be a pathway to do that, including a pathway to citizenship. 1 or 2 final comments I would make is that, one, I just don't think, given the divisive nature, and I'll just say divisive rather than dysfunctional, but right now the divisions between the parties, that a major, broad, all-inclusive, comprehensive package of legislative reform in the area of immigration is very unlikely to pass. So I'd encourage both sides of the aisle to look seriously, set priorities, and build out over the next year or two some incremental, significant, substantive, incremental changes, policy changes in the area of immigration. And the other observation I would make, because not only was I had the opportunity to vote on that last effort at immigration reform as a young congressman, but I saw the value of immigration as governor of Pennsylvania, where, believe it or not, agriculture is the #1 industry. And we literally had thousands and thousands of men and women traveled north for 6 or 7 months and then head back to their countries in Mexico, Central America and Mexico. And I'd just like to remind, and I may be wrong, and I could be dissuaded of this, but not everybody that wants to work here necessarily wants to become an American citizen. There's this bit of an arrogance that says that everybody who comes across the border wants to stay. They'd like to come across the border to work. They'd also like to go back home, back to their family, back to their community, back to their culture. So I think one of the first things they ought to try working on is I want all those men and women who are in our military right now to be at the front of the line to get their citizenship. But one of the other initiatives we ought to take is a guest worker policy that gives these men and women an opportunity to go back and forth. It enhances, it's smart, it's something the country needs, and it's certainly consistent with I think, moral leadership in treating our neighbors with respect and treating their citizens accordingly.
Secretary Johnson, building on what Secretary Ridge just said, I want to ask you the same question with a little bit of a twist, if you don't mind. And that is, of the four of you, you were the most recent Secretary of Homeland Security. And after you, there was a truly different approach to immigration over the last 4 years, a diametrically opposed set of policies with regards to immigration. So you may well agree that you probably don't start from, the Secretary Mayorkas doesn't start from where you ended. He starts from where the last 4 years have ended. With that in mind, what are the 2 or 3 most basic things that you think he needs to do with regards to immigration as a result of the policies of the last 4 years?
You're right. I dealt with this issue, the most recent among the 4 of us. For 3 years, I had this issue. I will tell you, immigration was the most difficult public policy issue, national security issue, any other issue I dealt with in public office. More difficult than drone strikes, Guantanamo, repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, cyber attacks, the Secret Service. It was the most difficult issue. And it's difficult not because there aren't answers. There are answers to our broken immigration system. There are common sense answers, but they are politically unobtainable. We've come close to passing comprehensive immigration reform in Congress several times, not just in the 1980s, but as recently as 2013, 2014. Most Americans, before Trump and after Trump, I believe, most Americans believe that we should treat fairly and humanely, consistent with American values, those who are here and those who seek to come here and seek asylum, want to become refugees, who are refugees from another land, consistent with our values. Most Americans believe that if you've been here for 10 years or more, you should be given a chance to be accountable and get on the books and pay taxes, as long as you haven't committed crimes. Most Americans believe, as Janet said, that we should prioritize who we deport. We should not just round up everybody like the last administration tried to do and deport anybody, everybody. We should prioritize. We should use our resources to prioritize the dangerous, those who are convicted felons. Most Americans believe we should take care of the dreamers, take care of the DACA class. There are, you know, as Janet knows, scores and scores of DACA kids, students at UC. Most Americans also believe that we should have a secure border. You go to Laredo, Texas, for example, in southern Texas, even there, it's 85% Mexican American. They believe we need to keep our border under control, but do so in a smart way, not just building a wall for the sake of building a wall. Ali's got a tough job in the wake of Donald Trump and Stephen Miller. I mean, they believed in deterrence on steroids. Their approach to immigration was, I'm going to make it so horrible for you to come here, you'd never think about coming here. Inhumane, it was cruel, child separation, and he's got to work his way back from that. And at the same time, he's got to deal with increasing levels of illegal migration on our southern border right now. I just saw a report that we're up to over 3,000 a day on the southern border. That's a lot. In my day, 5-6 years ago, over 1,000 was a bad day. Under 1,000 was a relatively good day. We're up to 3,000 now, and so he's got to get control of that. Ultimately, and I know President Biden believes this because we spent time talking about it. Ultimately, you got to deal with the problem at the source. You have to address the poverty and violence in Central America that is causing migrants to flee their homes in the first place. And unless we do that, we're going to continue to bang our head against this wall because there's no level of defense you can put on the southern border to prevent people who are making the very basic decision to flee a burning building, to flee a very, very dangerous part of the world.
One of our audience wants to know, what are the elements and the process for designating an organization or an individual as a domestic terrorist threat?
Well, there's several criteria. I don't know that I've ever seen them written down, but common sense tells you that it is similar to an international terrorist threat. It is a group, or indeed it can be an individual intent on committing an act of violence for the purpose of destabilizing or undercutting governmental institutions.
Doug, it's important to know that there is no legal mechanism for designating a domestic group as a terrorist organization. We designate foreign terrorist organizations as such overseas. There's a lot of thought being given to, should we designate domestic organizations, or can we designate domestic organizations as terrorist organizations? A lot of people in law enforcement will tell you that would not have much of a legal effect because we have the tools now on the books legally to prosecute those who are inclined toward terrorism in this country.
I think that's probably the best way to summarize it. I think Janet's right. I'm not sure, and Jay is right. I'm not sure there's a specific definition, but you know, if there's a violent act targeted toward a civilian, individual or group in order to affect the change in public policy, that would be a terrorist act, and you just arrest them and convict them under a criminal statute. So it's like everything else, you know, domestic terrorism when you see it.
Secretary Chertoff, given just the broad number of organizations, both domestic and foreign, that pose threats to the United States, is it too much for DHS? Should there be a broader mandate that includes other government organizations which now don't have the responsibilities that DHS does?
Well, I don't think adding more organizations is what's useful here. I mean, right now, if you're dealing with terrorism issues, the two principal organizations that deal domestically are DHS, and then the FBI does the investigation. The Department of Justice actually prosecutes, and that's more or less division of labor. You know, DHS is basically operating defensively, trying to harden a critical infrastructure, resilience, and also managing and patrolling air, sea, and land in the US for people coming in from outside, or, for example, attacking aviation. Obviously, when you deal with overseas terror, you also have DOD and the intelligence agencies like CIA also get involved in targeting and disrupting terrorist attacks that are being generated from overseas. So I think it's just a question of orienting the scope of what we're looking at, particularly on the intelligence collection, to look at threats that are more or less white supremacist or extremist, in addition to continuing to look at jihadis and other kinds of dangerous groups. As I said earlier, these white extreme groups are international themselves. They have links overseas, and in much the same way as some of the jihadi groups did, they may be loose networks, but they are networks.
Michael outlined for the audience, for you in the audience, the general responsibilities of the department that were embedded in from the get-go. It was a process where, frankly, in the bowels of the White House, during the several weeks that the creation of the department was under discussion, there were a variety of different organizations, independent organizations. They were the aggregation of potential entities to be melded into DHS was much broader than ultimately the configuration that was finally approved by Congress. It needs to go no further. But it does need leadership now, which it has with a very able secretary. It needs to have all those vacancies that were unfilled for much of the past 4 years to be completed. It needs to have its morale boosted and needs to get out of the center of much of the political activism that was generated by priorities that the president had set that turned it into a political piñata. And at the same time, I'd like to think that this administration with the secretary will appreciate the role and relationship it has developed from the outset. And I think Michael would speak to it, Janet would speak to it, Jeh would speak to it. I think a pretty solid relationship with state and locals to firm that up again, and then to enhance some of the intelligence and information and some of the training and some of the collaboration with the state and locals to deal with this with these domestic groups, whether they're from the right or the left, that I think are going to be a challenge for this and future administrations for a significant period of time. You don't need to put any new organizations in there. We've got new leadership, fill the vacancies, rebuild the morale, and take advantage of the relationships that existed that I think were torn apart in large measure by some of the actions taken by the previous administration. And I think the grossest example I happen to think was the abuse of sending in DHS personnel into Portland. DHS wasn't designed to be the militia. There are plenty of other domestic law enforcement agencies could have helped the federal government deal with that. So those would be my recommendations to the secretary. And I think all of us are absolutely delighted that he was appointed. And finally, his nomination went through. We're pleased for him, pleased for the department.
Thank you. Secretary Napolitano, in posing this final question to all four of you, I want to go beyond the structure of DHS or DHS per se. In the four of you here, you not only have four previous secretaries of the Department of Homeland Security, you have four Americans who have become synonymous with honesty and trust and respect. You are respected in the fields of politics, in the fields of policy, and in the fields of law. And with that in mind, I'd like to combine questions that raised issues like the following. Questions about economic inequality contributing to the kinds of violence we're seeing. Racism and racial inequality to the kind of violence we're seeing. Issues regarding freedom of speech and civil liberties. And issues regarding the political divisions that are as stark as I think any of us have ever seen in our lifetimes in this country. So I want to begin this question with a comment from the great 1960s philosopher Joan Baez, who was a leader during the protest movements of the 1960s and has been quoted as saying that in comparing the violence of the 60s and the violence of today, that back then protests were based on a feeling of community and that such a feeling does not exist today. President Biden has used as his major message the call for unity as the way to overcome chronic violence. So I would just like to ask each of you what your advice would be to this administration in terms of unity, and whether that is the term to use, and how you address a sense of community in order to also address some of the problems that you had to face in your cabinet positions.
I think President Biden's inaugural speech was a very important first step toward the healing that is long overdue, and not simply because of because of what happened or didn't happen during the past 4 years, but what has been a certain turbulence in the public square, maybe for the past 15 or 20. And the call for unity, at least in my mind, embeds in it a restoration of civility in the public space, civility in the public debate, civility toward one another. And unless and until that I think our political leadership in this country, and it goes on both sides of the aisle, quit demonizing one another, be more respectful of each other's belief, and work much harder to find common ground. We're going to continue to see these divisions fester and frankly get even worse. The best example I have for this, and it relates to President Biden, I had occasion to work with a wonderful college in my old congressional district that awarded a civility award on an annual basis. And one year they said, what about Vice President Biden and John McCain? And because I've been privileged in my public life to know them both, I said, great, let me talk to each one of them. And as soon as one found the other was being so recognized and celebrated, they both immediately said yes. The point being, I think John McCain's view of the world and policy writ large, probably there may have been some points of overlap with then Vice President Biden, but I suspect there were wide differences. But there's a certain element of respect and admiration they had for one another. Maybe it had to do with their respective backgrounds, but they had learned that that the country came first. And no matter whether you agree or disagree with them, that's the mindset they took. And I think the biggest challenge we have going forward to bring some substance back to the debates, the public policy arena, and to finally move this country more aggressively, move us forward rather than just turning every political issue and policy into a political football in order to win the next election. We need civility. And the other thing I think we need to remind our elected representatives on both sides of the aisle, there's two parts of the governing equation. You run to win and you win to govern. And both parties hopefully will remind themselves from time to time that the second part of the equation is why you got elected in the first place. But my judgment is we need to restore civility to the public arena. And I think Vice President is just the man to try to do it. And I think that it should be a strong bipartisan response to his outreach.
Thank you. Secretary Chertoff, your 3 minutes on this issue.
You know, I think this has been a challenge that's been building over a long period of time, not just in the last 4 years. I think Trump was a culmination of a sense on the part of a significant number of people, a minority, but still a significant number, that they were being disregarded and disrespected. And that anger caused them to really question all the foundations of what binds us together as a nation. So I think President Biden has made exactly the right first steps in terms of talking about unity, avoiding trying to be angry or finger pointing. There's going to be a balance between accountability on the one hand and not appearing to be vindictive on the other. And I think that's got to be addressed carefully. And I would say also transparency and honesty in government. All right, it's not going to be an overnight cure, but that will help build a sense of, because to my mind, in the end, what really makes us come together is mutual trust and trust in our institutions. One final thing. not just a gun issue. This is all of society issue. We need to get our business leaders, our religious leaders, our thought leaders, everybody who's in our media, our general media, have to begin to internalize the idea that, as Tom said, it's not just about winning, but it's about doing things in the right way. Because only if we all work together to move away from highlighting extremism or craziness, can we begin, it's going to take a while, can we begin to build the bonds of trust, which are the predicate to getting this unity of effort we so much desire to attain.
Thank you, Secretary Chertoff. Secretary Napolitano, you are the host here and have gathered us together. So you get the designated hitter spot at the end. And so I'm going to turn to Secretary Johnson for his comments on this question of unity.
Doug, your question brings to mind my father. My father passed away 8 days ago. Tomorrow I'm going to go to Nashville, Tennessee to bury him alongside his parents and his two brothers. My father his life spanned 16 presidents, from Herbert Hoover to Joseph Biden. When my father was born in 1931, his grandfather, who was an emancipated slave, was still alive. During my father's lifetime, he saw Jim Crow. He lived in the segregated South. He saw several wars, World War II. He saw the Great Depression. He saw the Korean War. He saw the Vietnam War. He saw the advent of the color TV, the mobile phone, the iPhone. He saw the election of a Black president, something he and I never thought we'd see in the course of our lifetimes. And he saw his own son sworn in as a member of the cabinet of that president. His father, my grandfather, was a sociologist. He lived his entire life in the segregated South. He talked a lot about civil rights in the 40s and 50s. And if you were a Black man with a PhD in the 40s and 50s, and you talked a lot about civil rights, you also had an FBI file. And my own grandfather in 1949 testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee to deny he was a member of the Communist Party. But he was also an optimist. The month before he died in 1956, he wrote something for the New York Times that I want to share with your audience, which I suspect includes a lot of students. This is something that my grandfather believed, my father believed, and I believe now, even given the current state of our democracy. Let me just take a moment. It is variously expected that Negro Southerners, as a result of their limited status in the racial system, would be bitter or hostile or impatient or indifferent. Bitterness grows out of hopelessness, and there is no sense of hopelessness in this situation, however uncomfortable and menacing and humiliating it may be at times. Faith in the ultimate strength of the democratic philosophy and code of this nation as a whole has always been stronger than the impulse to despair. I believe that too. Thanks.
Secretary Johnson, thank you so much. And I know on behalf of everyone here, we express our condolences to you on the passing of your father. And I know the pride that he absolutely felt in his son. Secretary Napolitano, in turning this to you for the final words on the issue of unity and on what President Biden has challenged this country in order to most effectively deal with the problems that you and your colleagues had to deal with at Homeland Security. I want to first thank and congratulate you and your colleagues for the founding of this center, and congratulate you especially on this outstanding discussion. It is a tribute to you that your colleagues would come and participate in it, and also to say thank you very much for letting me have a seat at your table and offer you a menu. And now, Secretary Napolitano, your views on unity and your closing thoughts.
Well, thank you, Doug. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank Tom and Michael and Jay for spending some time with us. You have been great leaders and great colleagues, confronting all the challenges that a Secretary of Homeland Security has to confront. I believe it is one of the most difficult jobs in the entire federal government, but one of the most rewarding at the same time. You know, I think Jay's words were beautifully stated. And I agree with them and with the comments of my other two colleagues. Let me add one final thought, which is that I think that the disunity that we are experiencing in our country emanates in part from a lack of trust in our institutions, a lack of trust in our government, a lack of trust in the media, a lack of trust in higher education. So I think restoring that trust will help us restore some sense of unity. So for President Biden, I think that he restores that trust by demonstrating that government can indeed work to improve the economic prosperity, the safety and security, and the sense of a future, a sense of hope amongst the American people. I think you can restore that sense of trust by getting control of this pandemic and getting a vaccination plan out and rolling so that we can get this pandemic behind us. I think you can restore that sense of trust by taking on in a reasoned and reasonable way some of the major issues that confront our country, be they immigration, be they issues emanating from climate change, be they issues of income inequality. You know, these are big issues and we talk about them a lot. A president can help lead us to helping to resolve them. And I think by showing that government can work and can work for the people, that will help restore trust. And out of trust, I think, comes a greater unity of effort and of purpose and a sense of country. So that's that is my hope for President Biden as he undertakes his presidency.
Thank you all. And Secretary Napolitano, I will leave it to you and pass the baton for closing of this seminar.
Thank you, Doug. I want to again thank Tom Ridge and Michael Chertoff, Jeh Johnson, and Doug Wilson for participating in this inaugural event of the Center for Security in Politics. We will put up a slide that shows a link to the webpage for additional information about the center. I want to thank Dean Brady and the Goldman School for hosting me as we develop this new center, which I anticipate and have great optimism will contribute much to our discussions on what is really meant by security in politics. Thank you all very much.